The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the CEO's office on the 45th floor. Mr. Chen sat at his desk, staring at an anonymous email that had just popped up on his screen. His hands trembled slightly as he read through the message for the third time. Another complaint about discrimination in his company, the fifth one this month. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. As a black CEO who had fought his way to the top through years of hard work and determination, these complaints hit close to home. But something felt different this time. The email detailed specific instances of qualified candidates being passed over, of subtle comments in meetings, of unofficial policies that seemed to be holding back minority employees. Running his hands over his face, Mr. Chen thought about his own journey. 20 years ago, he'd started as an intern, dealing with similar subtle discrimination. Now, as the head of one of the largest tech companies in the country, he had the power to actually do something about it. But sending out memos or hiring diversity consultants wouldn't cut it. He needed to see what was really happening on the ground floor. The idea hit him during his morning coffee meeting with his closest friend and head of security. What if, he said, pushing his cup aside, I could see how things really work when no one knows who I am. His friend raised an eyebrow, intrigued but concerned. Mr. Chen spent the next hour outlining his plan. He would need a complete transformation. Different clothes, different way of speaking, different everything. He'd go in as a new hire in the customer service department, where most of the complaints had originated. His friend listened, pointing out potential problems and solutions. The board won't like this, his friend warned. Mr. Chen smiled for the first time that morning. The board won't know. Only you and my executive assistant will know the truth. Everyone else will think I'm taking a sabbatical to work on our international expansion. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. Mr. Chen worked with a professional makeup artist who specialized in movie transformations. He practiced walking differently, speaking with a slight regional accent, even learned to write with his other hand to complete the disguise. He created a backstory. A former retail worker looking to break into the corporate world, starting at the bottom. Every night, he practiced his new identity in front of the mirror. He changed his wardrobe completely. No more tailored suits, only off-the-rack clothes that a new employee might wear. He even got a small apartment in a different part of the city to maintain his cover. His executive assistant helped create the perfect paper trail for his new identity. Everything had to be legitimate. They couldn't risk anyone digging too deep and discovering the truth. They carefully crafted a resume that would get him hired but wouldn't stand out too much. The night before his first day undercover, Mr. Chen sat in his new apartment, looking out at the city lights. He thought about all the people who had written to him about their experiences, all the talented individuals who might have been held back because of their race. Tomorrow, he would start seeing the company through their eyes. His phone buzzed, a text from his friend. You sure about this? Mr. Chen looked at his reflection in the window, barely recognizing himself in his new appearance. Never been more sure, he texted back. He set his alarm for 6 a.m., much later than his usual 4:30 a.m. CEO schedule. Tomorrow, he would walk through the same doors he'd been using for years, but this time as someone else entirely. He would sit in the orientation room instead of the boardroom. He would eat lunch in the cafeteria instead of his private office. As he prepared for bed, Mr. Chen felt a mix of emotions, nervousness about maintaining his cover, excitement about finally seeing the truth, and determination to make real changes if needed. He had built this company from the ground up, and if there was rot in its foundation, he needed to know. His last thought before falling asleep was about his father, who had always told him, "Sometimes you have to go backward to move forward." Tomorrow, he would put that wisdom to the test in a way his father probably never imagined. The alarm would ring in just a few hours, and a new chapter would begin, not just for him, but for every employee who had ever felt unseen or unheard in his company. Little did his employees know that their new coworker would be watching, listening, and preparing to make changes that would shake the corporate world to its core. The makeup artist's hands moved carefully across Mr. Chen's face, applying layers of specialized makeup with the precision of a painter working on a masterpiece. It was 4 a.m., and they were in a small, private studio on the outskirts of town. The transformation had to be perfect. It needed to last through a full workday and look completely natural under office lighting. Hold still, the artist murmured, dabbing at his face with a sponge. This part is tricky. She had worked in Hollywood for 15 years before starting her own discreet service for undercover operations. When Mr. Chen's security chief had approached her, she'd immediately understood the importance of absolute secrecy. The process took nearly 3 hours each morning. Mr. Chen used this time to mentally prepare for his role. He would silently practice his new way of speaking, the slight changes in his posture, the different way he would need to carry himself. Gone was the confident stride of a CEO. Instead, he needed to show the slight uncertainty of a newcomer to corporate culture. His security chief watched from the corner, occasionally offering suggestions. "Remember to slouch a little more when you sit," he advised. "And don't make eye contact for too long. You're supposed to be intimidated by the higher-ups." Mr. Chen had spent weeks studying people in coffee shops, observing how they moved, how they spoke, how they interacted. He'd even recorded himself practicing different gestures and expressions, watching the playback to ensure nothing gave away his true identity. The hardest part wasn't the physical changes, it was remembering to react differently to situations. When someone made a mistake, his instinct was to go into problem-solving mode. Now he had to remember to look confused, to ask for help, to make the kind of small errors a new employee might make. His phone buzzed. His executive assistant had sent the daily schedule for his replacement CEO, who was supposedly handling international business. Everything had to appear normal at the top while he worked undercover. The board had approved his temporary absence, thinking he was in Asia working on expansion deals. "What do you think?" the makeup artist asked, holding up a mirror. Mr. Chen barely recognized himself. The changes were supple but effective, slightly different skin tone, altered facial features, even his eye color was different thanks to specialized contacts. He practiced introducing himself. "Hi, I'm David Lee." His voice was higher, less authoritative, with a slight nervous tremor that he had practiced for weeks. The security chief nodded approvingly. The next phase was wardrobe. They had carefully selected clothes that were nice enough for an office but not too polished. A slightly ill-fitting suit jacket, shoes that were clean but showed some wear, a watch that kept perfect time but wasn't a luxury brand. Every detail mattered. His new apartment was furnished with second-hand items, stocked with the kind of groceries his character would buy. They'd even created a social media history going back 5 years, nothing too detailed, just enough to seem real if anyone looked. The security team had installed discreet monitoring devices in his apartment and car, keeping watch for his safety without being obvious. They had developed emergency protocols, code words, and signals if something went wrong or if his cover was at risk of being blown. During lunch breaks, he would need to make small talk, share simple stories about his fictional past. He had memorized every detail, where he went to school, his previous jobs, his hobbies. They had even created fake references and background check information that would hold up to HR scrutiny. As the final touches were applied, Mr. Chen practiced typing differently, slower, with more mistakes. He'd learned to use the common shortcuts instead of the executive ones he was used to. Even his phone was different now. A mid-range model instead of the latest flagship device. The sun was rising as they finished. Mr. Chen stood, getting used to the feeling of his transformed self. His security chief handed him a worn leather messenger bag containing his new employee orientation materials. "Remember," his friend said quietly, "if anything feels wrong, if you feel unsafe at any point, just use the signal. We'll have an excuse ready to get you out." Mr. Chen nodded, adjusting his collar one last time. In his mind, he ran through his backstory again. David Lee, 35, former retail manager, looking for a fresh start in the corporate world. Simple, believable, and most importantly, forgettable. As he drove to the office in his used sedan, so different from his usual luxury car, he caught glimpses of himself in the rearview mirror. Each time, it surprised him a little. The transformation wasn't just physical. It was a complete immersion into another life, another person's reality. He parked in the general employee lot, far from his usual reserved space. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed his bag and joined the stream of workers heading into the building. For the first time in years, he had to stop at security, show his ID, and get a visitor badge. First day, The security guard asked with a friendly smile, not recognizing the CEO he'd nodded to hundreds of times before. Yes, Mr. Chen replied in his practiced voice, adding just the right amount of nervous excitement. Looking forward to it. As he walked toward the orientation room, he felt the weight of his mission. This wasn't just about uncovering discrimination, it was about understanding the daily experiences of his employees, about seeing his company through new eyes. The real transformation was just beginning. The orientation room buzzed with nervous energy as 15 new employees fidgeted in their chairs. Mr. Chen, now David Lee, sat quietly in the back row, observing everything. The room looked different from this angle. He usually saw it from the front when giving speeches. Now he noticed the flickering fluorescent light in the corner, the slightly worn carpet, the old motivational posters that needed updating. The HR representative walked in, carrying a stack of papers. "Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your first day." Her smile seemed genuine, but Mr. Chen noticed how her eyes skipped over certain people in the room. A young woman in a hijab. A man with dark skin sitting near the front. Small things that might have gone unnoticed if he hadn't been looking for them. During the introduction round, he listened carefully to each person's story. A software developer from India with 10 years of experience, starting in an entry-level position because his previous work didn't meet our standards. A black woman with an MBA from a top university, beginning in customer service despite her qualifications. Each story added another piece to the puzzle he was trying to solve. When his turn came, he stumbled slightly over his words, just as he had practiced. "I'm David Lee, previously in retail management, excited to be here." Simple, forgettable, perfect. A few people nodded politely before turning their attention back to the presentation. The first red flag appeared during the team assignments. He watched as the hiring manager distributed role assignments, noticing a pattern. The most visible positions, those involving client interaction, seemed to go to employees of a certain appearance. Others, equally or more qualified, were assigned to back-office roles. During the lunch break, he sat alone at first, pretending to be absorbed in his phone. Soon, 2 other new employees joined him, the software developer and a Hispanic man who had been placed in data entry despite his background in project management. "At least the cafeteria food is good," the developer said, trying to sound upbeat. "Better than my last job." But Mr. Chen caught the resignation in his voice, the subtle acceptance of having to start over despite his experience. The afternoon brought department-specific training. Mr. Chen found himself in a small room with 5 others, learning basic customer service protocols he had helped develop years ago. The trainer, a middle manager he recognized from quarterly meetings, spoke differently to different team members. Some received patient explanations and encouragement. Others got brief, almost dismissive responses to their questions. One moment particularly caught his attention. A highly qualified Asian analyst asked about advancement opportunities. The trainer's response was telling. "Well, we have a very specific path for advancement. It's important to understand company culture first." The emphasis on culture made Mr. Chen's pen press a little harder into his notepad. During a coffee break, he overheard 2 managers talking near the vending machines. They didn't notice him. It was fascinating how invisible he had become in his new identity. Their conversation made his blood run cold. "Did you see the new batch?" one asked. "Yeah, quite diverse," the other replied with a slight grimace. "You know how it is. HR's quotas. Don't worry, we know where to place them." Back at his desk, Mr. Chen struggled to maintain his composure. He carefully noted down conversations, times, locations. His years of business experience helped him spot the subtle ways qualified candidates were being sidelined. A project reassignment here, a missed promotion opportunity there, small actions that added up to a larger pattern. By the end of the day, his feet hurt from the cheap shoes, his back ached from the intentionally poor posture, but his mind was racing. He had seen more in one day than in years of executive reports and diversity surveys. In the parking lot, he watched as different groups of employees headed to their cars. The subtle segregation was visible even here: who talked to whom, who shared rides, who hurried away alone. The company he had built, that he was so proud of, looked very different from ground level. At home that evening, in his modest temporary apartment, he carefully transcribed his notes while everything was fresh in his mind. His security chief had arranged a secure cloud server where he could document everything safely. The TV droned in the background. He kept it on to maintain his cover in case anyone visited. But his mind was on tomorrow, on what else he might discover. His hand paused over the notebook as he remembered something his mother used to say. The truth is like rain. It falls on everyone the same way, but not everyone feels it the same way. He was feeling it now, feeling the weight of every dismissive glance, every subtle rejection, every cultural fit comment. As he prepared for another day of his undercover mission, he realized this wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. It was about understanding the daily reality of his employees, the reality he had been too far removed to see. Setting his alarm for another early morning transformation session, Mr. Chen made a promise to himself. When this was over, when he could be himself again, things would change. Not with memos or policies or diversity training sessions, but with real, structural changes that would reshape the company from the ground up. But first, he had more to learn, more to understand. Tomorrow would bring new observations, new evidence, and perhaps new hope for creating the truly inclusive company he had always thought he was running. 2 months into his undercover role, Mr. Chen had developed a routine. Each morning, he'd arrive exactly 7 minutes before his shift, carrying a worn leather briefcase containing his lunch and a small notebook. His coworkers knew him as the quiet guy who always had a kind word, but mostly kept to himself. Perfect for observing without drawing attention. Today was different. The quarterly performance reviews were coming up, and the office was buzzing with nervous energy. Mr. Chen sat at his desk, pretending to focus on customer service calls while actually watching a scene unfold in the glass-walled conference room across the floor. Inside, he could see Mr. Park, the software developer with 10 years of experience, presenting something to the management team. Even from a distance, the body language told the story. The manager's leaning back, arms crossed, barely looking at the slides. Mr. Park's increasingly desperate gestures as he tried to explain what appeared to be an innovative solution. "Hey David," whispered his cubicle neighbor, "want to bet how this goes?" The colleague nodded toward the conference room. Park's been trying to get them to look at his system upgrade proposal for months. But watch, they'll probably give the project to you-know-who. Right on cue, another employee walked into the conference room, a recent graduate with 6 months of experience, but the right look and cultural fit, as the managers often said. Mr. Chen made a note in his phone, time-stamping the moment. During lunch, he sat with his usual group in the cafeteria. They had started calling themselves the back row crew, all highly qualified professionals who somehow always ended up in support roles. Today, they were discussing the upcoming company party. "Did you see the planning committee?" One of them asked, stirring her soup absently. "Not a single person of color." Again, the others nodded, unsurprised. Mr. Chen noted how they had learned to laugh about these things, humor as a defense mechanism against constant disappointment. Later that afternoon, he witnessed something that made his hand shake as he wrote his notes. A young woman, brilliant at data analysis, was explaining her findings to a supervisor. Her research had uncovered a significant cost-saving opportunity. The supervisor listened, nodded, then later presented the same findings to senior management as his own work. Mr. Chen excused himself to the bathroom, needing a moment to compose himself. In the mirror, he checked his makeup, still perfect thanks to the artist's skill. But his eyes held a storm of emotions. He had built this company from nothing, dreaming of a place where talent would be the only measure of success. How had it gone so wrong? Back at his desk, he opened a spreadsheet he'd been carefully maintaining. In it, he tracked every incident, dates, times, witnesses, patterns. The data told a clear story, one that would be impossible to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. A conversation by the printer caught his attention. 2 managers discussing an upcoming position. "What about that resume we got yesterday, the one with the great qualifications?" "Oh, you mean the one with the Chinese name?" "Yeah, let's put that in the review later pile. You know how clients are." Mr. Chen added another entry to his spreadsheet. His security chief had helped him set up a secure system to document everything legally. Audio recordings in permitted areas, copies of emails, screenshots of internal communications, all carefully gathered and stored. The most revealing evidence came from the company's own data. Using his basic employee access, he could see the patterns in promotions, project assignments, and performance reviews. The numbers painted a picture that no amount of diversity training videos could hide. One day, he stayed late, pretending to catch up on work. In reality, he was watching the cleaning staff, another layer of the company he had rarely paid attention to before. He noticed how management treated them differently based on their backgrounds, how some were ignored while others received friendly greetings. During team meetings, he observed the subtle ways ideas were dismissed or embraced depending on who presented them. He started tracking who got interrupted and who was allowed to speak freely. The patterns were undeniable. His notebook filled with quotes that made his stomach turn. "We need someone more polished for client presentations. They're just not a natural fit for leadership roles. Maybe they'd be more comfortable in our satellite office." Each evening in his temporary apartment, he would carefully transcribe his notes, adding them to the growing body of evidence. His security chief had arranged for everything to be documented in a way that would stand up to legal scrutiny if needed. The hardest part was maintaining his cover when he saw blatant injustice. His instinct was to step in, to fix things immediately. But he knew that would only address symptoms, not the disease. He needed to understand how deep the problems went before he could cure them. As the third month of his undercover work began, Mr. Chen noticed something else, the toll it took on people's spirits. Brilliant minds dimming their light, voices growing quieter, dreams being packed away in desk drawers. This wasn't just about discrimination, it was about wasted potential, about human beings being denied the chance to shine. His evidence painted a picture of not just individual acts of bias, but a system that perpetuated inequality while maintaining a facade of fairness. The company's diversity statistics looked good on paper, but the reality was very different. It wasn't just about who got hired, it was about who got heard, who got promoted, who got to lead. Looking at his growing collection of evidence, Mr. Chen knew he had more than enough to act. But he waited, gathering more, making sure his case would be unshakable. Because when he finally revealed himself, he wanted to do more than just expose the problem. He wanted to have enough evidence to force real, lasting change. It was a regular Tuesday morning when everything changed. Mr. Chen, still disguised as David Lee, sat in his usual spot in the break room, sipping coffee and pretending to read news on his phone. In reality, he was listening to a conversation between three senior managers who had gathered for their morning coffee ritual. The break room was nearly empty at this early hour. Most employees wouldn't arrive for another 30 minutes. The managers, feeling safe in what they thought was private space, spoke freely. They didn't notice the quiet employee in the corner. They never did. So, about these new diversity hiring initiatives, one manager said, stirring his coffee with obvious irritation, "HR's really pushing it this quarter." "Don't worry too much about it," another replied, lowering his voice but not enough. "I've got a system for handling these situations." Mr. Chen's hand tightened around his phone, the voice recorder app silently running. Over the next 15 minutes, he listened as they outlined their entire system, how they filtered resumes based on names, how they used coded language in interviews, how they steered certain employees away from client-facing roles. "The trick is," the third manager explained, "you can't be obvious about it. Everything has to look good on paper." The others nodded in agreement, sharing tips on how to maintain what they called company culture while appearing to follow diversity guidelines. As they spoke, Mr. Chen thought about Mr. Park's rejected promotion from last week, about the talented analyst who quit after being passed over 3 times, about all the patterns he'd documented over the past months. Everything was falling into place. The conversation shifted to an upcoming management position. "What about that application from the team lead in accounting? The one with all the certifications?" "Oh, you mean Ms. Wong? Yeah, great qualifications, but..." The manager made a vague gesture. "You know how it is. Clients expect a certain presence in management roles." Mr. Chen's coffee had gone cold, but he barely noticed. His notes app was filling with timestamps and quotes. This wasn't just casual bias. This was systematic discrimination being planned and executed at a management level. Later that day, he watched as these same managers conducted interviews for a senior position. Through the glass walls of the conference room, he could see their body language change depending on who sat across from them. Some candidates received warm smiles and engaged questions. Others faced crossed arms and short responses. During lunch, he overheard two of the managers discussing how to guide certain employees toward back-office roles. "It's for their own good," one said. "They'll be more comfortable there." The other agreed, adding, "Plus, it keeps things smoother with clients." Mr. Chen excused himself from his desk, walking to the bathroom where he could safely text his security chief. "We need to move faster," he wrote. "It's worse than we thought." The breaking point came during an afternoon department meeting. The managers were discussing team assignments for an upcoming client project. Mr. Chen watched as they systematically excluded qualified team members using various excuses. "They're not ready for client interaction. Their communication style might not suit this client. We need someone more polished for this role." Each excuse was carefully worded to sound reasonable while masking the real reasons. Mr. Chen noticed how some employees had stopped volunteering for projects altogether, having learned through experience that they wouldn't be chosen. Back at his temporary apartment that evening, he spread out all his evidence: notebooks, recordings, screenshots, data analyses. 3 months of documentation revealed a clear pattern of systematic discrimination that went far beyond individual bias. He called his security chief, speaking in hushed tones despite being alone. "I've seen enough," he said. "We need to end this now." They spent hours planning the next steps. Every detail had to be perfect. Mr. Chen knew that simply exposing the problem wouldn't be enough. He needed to create a situation where denial would be impossible. The final straw had been watching a young employee, bright and capable, being told she wasn't management material despite her excellent performance records. The look in her eyes, the moment when hope died, reminded him of his own early career struggles. As he prepared for bed that night, Mr. Chen thought about all the talented people who had left the company, all the potential that had been wasted, all the dreams that had been crushed under the weight of systematic discrimination. His phone buzzed, a message from his executive assistant confirming that everything was ready for tomorrow. In less than 24 hours, he would reveal himself and confront the managers with their own words and actions. Looking in the mirror one last time, checking that his disguise was perfect for what would be its final day, Mr. Chen felt a mix of anger and determination. Tomorrow would change everything. The facade of inclusion would be torn down, and the truth would finally come to light. He set his alarm, knowing it would be his last morning of transformation. As he lay in bed, he thought about how his company's motto, "Innovation through Inclusion," had become just empty words on a wall. Tomorrow, he would start the process of making those words mean something again. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable. Now it was time to act, to confront those who had twisted his company's values, and to begin the hard work of real change. As he drifted off to sleep, Mr. Chen knew that tomorrow would be more than just a revelation. It would be a revolution in how his company operated. The company auditorium buzzed with confusion. An all-hands meeting had been called without warning, scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp. Employees filed in, whispering among themselves, wondering what could be so important. The management team sat in the front row, looking slightly annoyed at the unexpected interruption to their day. Mr. Chen, still in his David Lee disguise, sat quietly in the middle section, surrounded by his fellow customer service representatives. His heart was pounding, but his face remained calm. 3 months of practice had made him excellent at hiding his emotions. At exactly 10 a.m., his executive assistant walked onto the stage. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming on such short notice. We have an important announcement from the CEO." The crowd stirred. Everyone knew the CEO was supposed to be in Asia handling international business. A few managers checked their phones, wondering if they'd missed some crucial email. The assistant continued, "For the past 3 months, our CEO has been conducting a detailed investigation into our company's practices. Today, he's here to share his findings." Confused murmurs filled the room. The managers in the front row exchanged worried glances. Mr. Chen took a deep breath and stood up from his seat in the middle of the audience. "Actually," he said, using his natural voice for the first time in months, "I'm already here." He walked toward the stage, reaching up to peel away the professionally applied makeup that had been his mask for the past 3 months. The room fell silent. Then gasps of recognition rippled through the crowd as their CEO emerged from the disguise of David Lee, the quiet customer service representative they'd been working alongside. As he reached the stage, the screen behind him came to life, displaying a simple message: innovation through inclusion, making it real. For the past 3 months, he began, his voice firm but not angry. I've been working among you as David Lee. I've answered customer calls, attended team meetings, and experienced our company culture firsthand. What I discovered was both enlightening and deeply troubling. The managers in the front row had gone pale. Some were frantically scrolling through their phones, probably trying to remember every interaction they'd had with David Lee. I want to share some stories with you, Mr. Chen continued. But first, I want you to know why I did this. This company was built on the idea that talent and hard work should be the only factors in success. I needed to know if we were living up to that promise. The screen behind him changed to show a series of graphs and statistics. These numbers tell part of the story, but the real story is about people, our people. He began sharing specific incidents, careful to protect individuals' privacy while making the patterns clear. The time a brilliant software proposal was dismissed without consideration, the countless qualified candidates steered away from client-facing roles, the promotion decisions made based on cultural fit rather than merit. Yesterday morning in the break room, he said, looking directly at 3 specific managers, I heard a detailed explanation of how resumes are filtered based on names, how candidates are steered away from certain positions, how our diversity initiatives are systematically undermined. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. Some employees had tears in their eyes, finally seeing their experiences validated. Others looked shocked, having never realized what was happening around them. I sat in meetings where talented people were passed over. I watched as ideas were dismissed not on their merits, but based on who presented them. I saw the toll this takes, not just on individuals, but on our entire company. He played a few carefully selected audio clips, all legally recorded in public spaces. The manager's own words filled the auditorium, their casual discrimination now exposed to everyone. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame, Mr. Chen continued. This is about acknowledging a problem so we can fix it. I'm not just your CEO. I'm someone who has experienced discrimination firsthand throughout my career. I thought we had built something different here. Now I know we still have work to do. He outlined specific examples of excellence he'd witnessed, employees whose talents had been overlooked, ideas that had been dismissed, potential that had been wasted. For each negative example, he shared a positive one, showing both what was wrong and what was possible. Tomorrow, things will change, he said firmly. But today, I want every person in this room to know I saw you. I worked beside you. I learned from you. And I'm sorry it took becoming David Lee to understand what many of you face every day. The screen behind him showed photos of his transformation process, his daily disguise routine, the apartment he lived in. This wasn't a trick or a gotcha moment. This was about understanding the truth so we can make real change. He shared stories of resilience he'd witnessed, employees supporting each other, small acts of kindness, people finding ways to excel despite the obstacles placed in their way. This spirit, this determination is what our company should be built on. As he concluded, he made a promise. Tomorrow, we start rebuilding. Not with memos or training sessions, but with real, structural changes. Some people will no longer be part of our company. Others will find opportunities they should have had long ago. All of us will learn to do better. The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous level. People were standing, some crying, others nodding in determination. The managers in the front row remained seated, their faces a mix of shame and fear. One last thing, Mr. Chen said as the applause died down. To everyone who shared their lunch breaks with David Lee, who helped him learn the systems, who treated him with kindness, thank you. You showed me who we really can be as a company. As the employees filed out of the auditorium, the atmosphere was electric with a mix of shock, hope, and anticipation. Everyone knew that tomorrow would bring big changes, but today they had witnessed something unprecedented, a leader who cared enough to walk in their shoes, to see the truth with his own eyes, and to stand up and say, enough. The next morning, the office felt different. Security guards escorted several managers from the building, their access cards already deactivated. Each carried a small box of personal items, their faces a mix of anger and resignation. Employees watched silently from their desks, the reality of change settling in. Mr. Chen arrived early, back in his usual suit but somehow different, more approachable, more connected to his employees. He'd spent the night reviewing personnel files and preparing for what would be the most important day in his company's history. The first announcement came at 9 a.m. through a company-wide email. Effective immediately, we are implementing a complete restructuring of our management team and hiring practices. Today is day one of the new chapter in our company's story. By 10 a.m., the changes began rolling out. Mr. Park, the software developer whose innovations had been repeatedly ignored, was called to the CEO's office. He emerged 30 minutes later as the new head of technology innovation, his eyes bright with disbelief and determination. The talented analyst who had watched her ideas being stolen found herself in a newly created position, Director of Data Strategy. Her first task: building a transparent system for tracking and crediting innovations within the company. Throughout the day, similar scenes played out across departments. People who had been overlooked for years suddenly found doors opening. But it wasn't just about promotions, it was about changing the entire system. In the cafeteria, the back row crew found themselves sitting at a table with Mr. Chen himself. "I missed our lunch conversations," he said, setting down his tray. "But today, I want to hear your ideas about how we can do better." They spent the hour discussing real solutions. One suggested a blind review system for project proposals. Another proposed mentorship programs that would pair senior executives with employees from underrepresented groups. Each idea was noted down, not dismissed. The HR department underwent a complete overhaul. The new head of HR, a woman who had previously been stuck in middle management despite her exceptional qualifications, immediately began implementing new hiring and promotion protocols. "No more cultural fit excuses," she announced in her first department meeting. "We're looking for cultural contribution. What unique perspectives and experiences can each person bring to our team?" The afternoon brought the launch of several new initiatives. A company-wide audit system was implemented to track promotion patterns and pay equity. Anonymous reporting channels were established, with reports going directly to a newly formed ethics committee made up of employees from all levels of the company. The most dramatic change came in the form of the open door review. Any employee who felt they had been unfairly passed over for opportunities in the past could schedule a meeting to have their case reviewed. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of employees signed up in the first hour. Mr. Chen didn't hide in his office during this transition. He walked the floors, talking with employees, listening to concerns, and sometimes just observing. The company he saw now was different from both the one he thought he ran and the one he'd experienced as David Lee. In the customer service department, his former coworkers were surprised to find their suggestions about improving systems being not only heard but implemented. The woman in the hijab who had sat quietly in orientation 3 months ago was now leading a task force on customer experience innovation. The tech team, once dominated by a single demographic, began to transform. Resumes that would have been filtered out in the past were now being given fair consideration. By the end of the week, 3 new team leads had been appointed, each bringing unique perspectives and proven talents that had previously been overlooked. 1 month into the changes, the results were already showing. Employee satisfaction scores rose dramatically. Innovation metrics showed a sharp uptick. Even customer feedback improved as a more diverse workforce brought new insights into product development and service delivery. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Some longtime employees resisted the changes, clinging to old ways of thinking. Mr. Chen addressed this head-on in a company-wide meeting. "Change is hard," he acknowledged. "But staying the same was harder on the people we hurt. We can either adapt and grow, or we can step aside for those who will." The company's story began making headlines. Other CEOs called, wanting to know how they could implement similar changes. Mr. Chen's response was always the same: start by really seeing your people, all of them. 6 months later, the company had been transformed. The old hierarchy had been replaced by a more fluid structure that emphasized talent and innovation over tradition and connections. Employee retention rates soared, particularly among minority groups who had previously felt stalled in their careers. The most touching moment came during a year-end gathering. An employee stood up to share his story. "A year ago, I was thinking about quitting. I didn't see a future here. Today, I'm leading projects I care about, working with people who respect me, and actually excited to come to work." Mr. Chen kept the David Lee disguise in a small display case in his office, not as a trophy but as a reminder. Sometimes, he would tell visitors, you have to change your perspective to see the truth. And once you see it, you have to have the courage to act on it. The company's new motto, displayed prominently in the lobby, read, "Innovation through real inclusion. Every voice matters, every talent counts." But more importantly, these weren't just words on a wall anymore. They were the living, breathing reality of a workplace transformed by truth and determination.